The Supreme Court just issued one of the most damaging voting decisions in decades. This was not an accident. This was by design. Trust. This was the plan all along. Let's talk about it. A lot of this conversation is being talked about in legalese using legal jargon, and that's also by design, to keep the average American citizen confused. Let's break down what happened in the Supreme Court for the cheap seats in the back. First, what is Louisiana versus Callais? So yesterday, April 29th, 2026, the Supreme Court's Republican-appointed majority struck down in a 6-3 vote Louisiana's congressional map. And this is the one that included a second majority Black congressional district. Here is what we need to understand about why this map existed in the first place. Louisiana has 6 congressional seats. Black voters make up roughly 1/3 of the state's population. And for years, they were packed into one single district. This means that their political power was deliberately contained. Courts found that the original map likely violated the Voting Rights Act, and Louisiana was ordered to draw a new, fairer map, one that gave Black voters a second district. So they drew it. And then, this is the part that we need to sit with. The state turns around and sues to kill the very map that they were required to draw. Violation indeed. So in this recent term, Louisiana says that the map violated the Constitution. And here's the gag. During oral arguments, Justice Clarence Thomas asked the state solicitor general, why did Louisiana decide to switch sides? And here's what he had to say. His answer was because the courts now have an opening, so they're going to take it. Justice Samuel Alito wrote the majority opinion saying the Voting Act's right didn't require Louisiana to create an additional majority minority district. So there was no compelling interest justifying the state's use of race in the drawing of the map. Therefore, it's an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. Let's translate that. The court said that the remedy for the discrimination is absolutely the cure. That in itself is discriminatory. So the cure is the problem. That's the argument. That's what 6 justices agreed to. 6-3. Let's talk about Section 2 and why it's important. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act has operated for over 4 decades on one core principle. When an electoral system produces racially discriminatory results, violates federal law. Even without proof that anyone in the room has said specifically, hey, let's target Black people, the results will and absolutely do matter. The outcome matters. For decades, Section 2 served as a powerful mechanism to address discrimination against Black voters in particular, and of course, other voters of color. So yesterday, the Supreme Court decided to rewrite it, claiming to leave the law intact while making it infinitely more difficult, if not impossible altogether, to prove that violations do exist when it comes to race or civil rights. As Justice Keegan stated in her dissent, today's decision renders Section 2 all but a dead letter. So this statute will stay on the books, but the enforcement mechanism that gives it its teeth or gives it its power is completely ripped out. It's a law with no bite. Let's get into the full picture, the overarching context, because this does not happen in a vacuum. This is not a silo, right? This is America, KKK, America. What happened yesterday is a continuation. So in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed in the wake of Bloody Sunday. Remember the infamous movie Selma, right? And crossing the bridge, the view, the Pettus Bridge. So yeah, in the wake of Bloody Sunday in Selma, it was the federal government's acknowledgement that Black people had been systemically denied their vote through literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and outright violence. So Section 5 requires that certain states, the ones with the worst histories of discrimination, get to have federal permission before changing any voting law. It's called pre-clearance. You have to show your work before you can change the rules. For nearly 50 years, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act requires certain jurisdictions, including the states, counties, cities, and the towns with a history of chronic racial discrimination, we're looking at you, Louisiana, in voting to submit all proposed voting changes to the U.S. Department of Justice or the federal court before implementation. Then, in 2013, the Supreme Court, they gutted it. Shelby County versus Holder. The court said that the preclearance formula was outdated. Discrimination in voting was no longer concentrated in the way that it used to be, so the effects of the ruling were immediate. That same day, Texas officials announced that they would implement the nation's most restrictive voter ID law, and this one had been previously blocked by preclearance. In the wake of Shelby County, states unleashed a torrent of voter suppression schemes. After Shelby took Section 5, the last real enforcement mechanism left standing was Section 2. Section 2 was the fallback. This was the emergency brake. This is the thing that Black voters and civil rights organizations, the last thing that we had left to fight with. And yesterday, the court took that too. Congressman James Clyburn called it a step backwards in the pursuit of a more perfect union, noting that the court seems hell-bent on redeeming the post-Reconstruction America that neutered the 1875 Civil Rights Act and eliminated African-American political representation in multiple Southern states. He's not being dramatic. He's being historically accurate. We've seen this before. Reconstruction happened, and then that was dismantled piece by piece in slow motion and legalese, with a lot of the Supreme Court majority calling it equal protection. Here's where I want us to understand that this always is about Black women at the root of it all. Isn't it always? And we're going to utilize my Plight of the Hot Girl framework. This is always about the systems that extract our power, contain our influence, and then tell us that we are the problem after we try to exert our agency and authority whenever we try to push back. Let's run the framework. First up is narrative control. Who gets to tell the story of equal protection under the law? The court just redefined equality as colorblindness. Formal equality over substantive equality. They're acknowledging that voting discrimination exists, but they're terminating the remedy anyway. And that's a move to control the narrative. They are going to decide, they being the Supreme Court, but really that's the veil. Underneath is the systemic oppression of white supremacy, blowing the whistle, writing the rules. They have decided what the story of equality is going to mean, clearly determined to write Black people completely out of it. For years, Louisianans organized, legislated, and litigated for the promise of a fair and representative congressional map. And they won in court twice. That map was drawn. And then the very tools, the very mechanisms that they used to win, they used that to weaponize against them, to strip away the bench. That fight happened, that victory happened, and then the system responded by changing the rules after the fact, always trying to change the rules. Let's talk complicity as survival. Louisiana's very own state government were the ones that drew the court-ordered map, and then they sued the government in order to strike the map that was drawn. They were responsible for the citizens of Louisiana's very disenfranchisement, and that's the gag. This is the system that is supposed to be protecting you and supporting you as a citizen, and yet they're literally weaponizing their power against you. That is complicity operating at the governmental level. When institutions designed to protect you become the apparatus of your suppression, that's the feature of the system. That is by design. That is not an accident. And lastly, let's talk bodily commodification. As Black people, Black women in particular, our political bodies, just like our collective power, have been restricted, diluted, gerrymandered, and now legally quarantined from remedy. It's as though the body politic mirrors the physical body, controlled, contained, and defined by the system, defined by those who profit from our diminishment and our exploitation. We're always worth more to the system when they can capitalize on what we can produce, create, and how they can commodify us. We're always going to be worth more to the system as labor, as opposed to being viewed as citizens with actual power. And yesterday's vote from the Supreme Court solidified that ideal. Let's never forget that this ruling is going to impact Black women the most. The impact of this decision could be the greatest on Black women in particular, because we're the ones who have worked to make historic gains in representation in elected office. And since Section 2 was strengthened by Congress in the 1980s, the 1980s saw the biggest spike of Black women serving in the House and the Senate. Now there are 27 Black women in the lower chamber and 2 in the upper chamber. Whoop, whoop. But that's 27 in 40 years. And every single one of those seats was shaped by the fight for majority minority districts, and that very mechanism the court is trying to cripple, has in fact succeeded in crippling. Women of color voters, Black women voters, are disproportionately concentrated in majority minority districts, particularly in the South and the Pacific West. So when they gut Section 2, they're not abstractly gutting voting rights, but they're specifically targeting the upward mobility and pipeline through which Black women in particular enter the political ring. They're pulling the ladder up and they're slamming the door so that no one else can get in behind the Black women that have already succeeded. And this is where the framework comes into play again, Plight of the Hot Girl. This ruling weakens the ability of voters of color, Black voters in particular, to secure representation that's going to genuinely reflect their needs on issues like healthcare access, economic justice, reproductive rights, education, and et cetera, and et cetera. And Black women are the most consistent voting bloc in the democracy. We show up at every single cycle, every single election, and every time, often in states where our votes are the only thing standing between extremism and a margin, we're there. We are she that holds the line. And the Supreme Court clearly communicated that our organized political power is a threat and it can be erased by drawing a line. But none of this is new. That's the Plight of the Hot Girl framework applied to body politics. Black women produce, we labor, we slave, we organize, we succeed. And then the system always finds a way to weaponize and extract our productivity, our labor, our bodies, and limiting our power and our access, reducing our agency, silencing our voice, controlling our narratives. The suppression of Black political power is not a side effect of the system. It's a feature of the system. And that's always required Black bodies to be diminished in order to sustain the system. So what do we do now? Well, we have to move from indictment to intention, because if we stay here, stay in our righteous anger without any type of direction, we're going to risk the type of paralysis that serves the system, the very system that we're trying to fight. So with that, I'm always going to introduce the love meditation, because love is not a soft aspect. And this framework is filled with discipline, actionable practice that help to yield the results that change yourself and ultimately those around you. Firstly, we're going to have to sit with and label the grief and understand that what we're feeling is not by accident, but it's by design, that it is making us feel despair, hopeless, frustrated, angry, hurt, etc., etc. But then we recognize that feelings are not facts. After we sit with these feelings, we name them, we label them, we're going to release this despair and turn them into an actual practice. If you're able, get outside and walk, move, stretch, organize a physical session to release that stress, that tension. We can only control the things that we can control, and that starts with our minds and our body. And sometimes when we can't set our minds immediately, the body in motion, which is love in motion, will begin the domino effect that sparks a clearer mind. So again, get to moving in any way possible. Step outside, get to a gym, turn on a YouTube video, and push play on a Pilates session you deserve. We need to realize that this is not the end of the story. We shall not remain hopeless, right? As God grants us the ability to rise and see another day, we are blessed with daily and fresh new mercies. And we even have the ability to keep hope alive, like Jesse Jackson used to say. Although Congress retains the authority to strengthen voting rights and the voting protections, state legislators can adopt independent redistricting commissions. Voters can reach out to elected officials at every level and demand that they publicly take a stand for voting rights. So the Supreme Court is not the only factor here. And the systems built on suppression have always eventually collapsed under the weight of organized people. So there's no better time than now to get out and exercise your right to vote, especially in these midterm elections. I'm going to leave some links below if you're in doubt or confused as to if you're registered, where to go, where to vote. I'm also going to drop a link from Representative Jasmine Crockett, who held an emergency town hall meeting on her YouTube channel, which was a phenomenal act of public servitude and political prowess. She's such a beast, my soror. On this live, she gathers another group of dynamic, intelligent, powerful Black women, even some of those Black women that argued within the Supreme Court just this week. And they further discuss in detail the ways that this new ruling is going to directly impact Black women, Black bodies, and our Black communities in particular. That video is laced with not only education, but next steps so that we can work together towards solutions. I strongly encourage you to watch, share, discuss, and take action. But that's anchored in faith. Stay rooted in the fact that God is always in control. We're going to pray and work, fight and pray. Faith without works is dead. Keep in mind that we are a sacred people. And with that, we're going to source out that sacred community that we talk about within the love meditations. Again, sacred community are those groups that will uplift you in faith and hold you in love. And we deserve. Remember that Black women are always at the forefront of expanding representation. And that's not going to change anytime soon. We're still going to stay in the fight, even here on this little channel and at large within your community. So what you do within your community and in your smaller circles, it does matter. Consider your local elections, state legislator, your school board, your city council. This is where maps are really drawn in the day-to-day battles in the community, boots on the ground. I know we said Black women were resting in this season, but did we ever get an opportunity to rest? No. We're the only ones that are going to save this country from itself. Remember to keep at the forefront your intentional living, okay? You cannot afford to be politically passive in this moment, nor can you afford to have your health and wellness slip as a priority. So get educated, get activated, and then share what you know. Treat your local elections with the same excitement and vigor that we do national elections, because this is where, again, those lines get drawn on the day-to-day. Protecting your political power is an act of self-love. Never forget that. Showing up for your community is an act of self-love. Remember that we are large and we are powerful. We're blessed beyond measure. And they wouldn't come for us if they didn't realize that we were such a threat. So stay encouraged. The Supreme Court just confirmed that federal protection has limitations. That just means that our community protections have to be limitless. Until next time, remember that you deserve. Take care of yourselves and each other.